welcome to episode 44 of Let's Talk Bitcoin for September 24th, 2013. Visit us at letstalkbitcoin.com for our daily guest blog, all our past episodes, and of course, tipping options. On Thursday, the 26th of September, I'll be speaking on the Bitcoin panel at the C2SV conference in San Jose, California, right after the keynote. If you're attending, be sure to stop by and say hi. We'll be in Atlanta in early October for several days. For conference meetups, visit letstalkbitcoin.com/meetup. My name is Adam B. Levine, and today's show is about the inevitability of change. The Bitcoin community is often referred to as an entity, but really it's a bunch of subgroups with interests that sometimes overlap, but other times, not so much. I've got a theory about entrepreneurs and idealists, and we talk about it towards the middle of today's show. Daniel Larimer is a man who sees the future, and we sat down last week to talk about Project Quixote, the intersection of identity, trusted communications, and finance, how you'll mine your next username, and send bitcoins to human-readable addresses just like email. Mt. Gox is back in the news, and we wrap up the episode with the latest in lawsuits and the 6-day gotcha. But first, Bitcoin has no chargebacks. Is that good or bad? We look at the recent chaos surrounding the freeze of Butterfly Labs' PayPal account and subsequent refund storm. Once again, I'm joined by the other hosts of Let's Talk Bitcoin, Andreas M. Antonopoulos and Dr. Stephanie Murphy.
Guys, I heard that Butterfly Labs is starting to ship promptly to certain customers. It seems to be the ones who are filing credit card chargebacks if they paid for their mining equipment with a credit card are getting their orders shipped quickly. At least that's some of the reports that we're hearing from Reddit. It got me thinking about the topic of Bitcoin and chargebacks in general. I heard the great interview that you did, Adam, with Mark Hochstein at the New York conference, and he had some interesting stuff to say about chargebacks. All of the legacy banking system has chargebacks built into it. There aren't that many irreversible payment methods, which creates some issues when you're trying to convert legacy currency into Bitcoin. Classic example of people who try to sell Bitcoins on eBay. Somebody sends them a PayPal and then does a chargeback later and gets the Bitcoin and the money because the Bitcoin transaction is irreversible, whereas the dollar transaction can be reversed through chargebacks. I think there is a definite role for payment that are not subject to chargebacks, that are irreversible. There are some people who want to kind of build chargebacks into Bitcoin. I guess I was thinking about the whole topic.
It's not just chargebacks that's happening for Butterfly Labs. Let's talk about that specific situation for a second. On the one hand, they've got these credit card refunds that are going through, but then on the other hand, actually, there's been a lot of movement in the space reaching out to the higher echelons of PayPal. I've seen a couple of these threads pop up, and it looks like people are getting, thousands of dollars back refunded by PayPal because Butterfly Labs hasn't fulfilled a number of their terms. They haven't delivered. They've refused refunds. At this point, they're known that they're not delivering in a timely fashion. And so some people have gotten full high in the ranks at PayPal to just push the button and start processing these transactions. I know of at least 25 or 30 people who have gotten back more than $1,000 in the last maybe week as a result of using this process. It does go to emphasize that on the one hand, Bitcoin is great because it doesn't put these potential burdens on the vendor or the manufacturer or whoever is actually doing the selling. But it really shows that people who didn't pay with PayPal or pay with credit card, people who paid with Bitcoin, they have no recourse in this situation. They're completely reliant on the goodwill of Butterfly Labs. And the reality is that Butterfly Labs at this point doesn't really have any goodwill for them for whatever reason. I mean, it could be because they don't have the money because it's all been spent on manufacturing or whatever, but they haven't held up to their end of the bargain. And the people who have recourse are the people who avoided paying in Bitcoin. And it's important to keep in mind here that these same people are the people who also got the worst part of the deal, because as they've been waiting, those people who paid in Bitcoin have had the value of the Bitcoins that they spent for nothing go up. It just goes to show, for me, again, that you can't place pre-orders with Bitcoin because it has all of these reasons why that's a terrible idea.
It's such an interesting double-edged sword, right? Because as a buyer, you want protection in case something that you pre-order, in this case, or something that you buy doesn't come in the form that you expected it in a timely manner. this case, the people who pre-ordered with Bitcoin from Butterfly Labs got the short end of the stick because they did pay with this irreversible payment system. When you're a buyer, you want protection of having the option to do a chargeback or having some kind of recourse. When you're a seller, you want the transaction to be irreversible, right? So maybe it depends on whether people are acting as buyers or sellers in each transaction, but it can be a double-edged sword, right? Because a lot of the same people who placed pre-orders with Butterfly Labs in Bitcoin and got totally shafted, basically, in some other situations, they're really glad that Bitcoin transactions are irreversible.
I think it has a lot to do with the seller too. The seller has to be responsible. That's really the thing that Bitcoin puts on there. There's no get out of jail free card. But if you're dealing with a seller who is responsible and who values their reputation, which clearly for whatever reason, either they can't pay attention to their reputation or it's not that important to them, but it's not a motivating factor for Butterfly Labs.
I think in the end, it's the buyer who has to be responsible. They have to be responsible for the security of their purchase. And what Bitcoin does is it introduces or reintroduces caveat emptor, buyer beware. Bottom line here is that if people were making this transaction on the street in cash, the cultural signifiers of cash would get their brain into gear and tell them caveat emptor, you're handing cash over. Look the other person carefully in the eye and make sure you're going to get a product in return. It's because this is a new form of payment and people are doing this online. The cultural signifiers of danger, irreversible payment aren't quite there. And people don't quite think it through. I think over time, if you have an established irreversible currency in the culture, people become used to it. You don't walk up to someone and hand them a big chunk of cash because you know better. And I think over time, people will learn to associate Bitcoin with irreversibility the same way.
So is this a first world problem then? Because in the US, at least, it seems people are really, really used to using plastic to pay for everything. Whereas in other parts of the world, I imagine that cash transactions are much more the norm, especially places where people are unbanked. And so they're not going to have access to a debit card, a credit card, or a bank account, all of which are reversible kinds of transactions. What do you guys think? Is this a first world problem?
Very much so. It's typical. Irreversible transactions are not a bug. They're the most important feature of Bitcoin, or one of the most important features of Bitcoin. The fact that it's a push currency instead of a pull currency, I think, is pretty critical. It took me several months to figure this out when I first found out about Bitcoin. As you get to use it for a while, you gradually start to realize that it's not the same as other currencies.
When we talk about a push currency versus a pull currency, that's to say that when I'm spending money, I send a payment rather than receiving a request for payment.
Well, more so that no other party can take a payment. Pretty much in most of the other transactional systems, whether that's debit cards, credit cards, checking accounts, things like that, in all of those cases, someone else can debit your account with the appropriate authorization, I guess, in advance.
And the authorization is the important part there, right? Because if you have the authorization, it doesn't matter what your identity is, because that assumes that the identity that is in control has authorized, has given you permission, even if not for this particular transaction.
Right. It's a difference between control and authorization. You never have the control with those payment systems, but you may also give up the authorization. With Bitcoin, you are the only one who has the control. And therefore, the only way you can really transact in Bitcoin is by giving the authorization to someone else to spend it. That's what spending Bitcoin means. There's no way to do a pull transaction with Bitcoin. You can't charge someone else Bitcoin unless they decide to spend it. And I think that's a wonderful feature. It's a fundamental characteristic of Bitcoin. It will take a while to get used to it.
One of the things that I've honestly had a lot of trouble with, in dealing with Bitcoin compared to dealing with the types of monies that we deal with normally, is that the denomination actually gives me a lot of trouble. I have a hard time keeping in my head that, 0.25 Bitcoin at current exchange rates is about $40. That doesn't seem like that much to me because it's a decimal. So I wonder if there isn't an element of that in it too.
Yeah, that reminds me, Adam, of a time when I was at the Porcupine Freedom Festival this summer, and I was buying a soda from Revolution Coffee, which had the Lamassu vending machine there, and I was about to send them 0.02 Bitcoins for the soda, and instead I hit 0.2, and I sent them 0.2 Bitcoins for this quota. So I overpaid 10 times. And of course, I couldn't reverse that transaction because I had already hit send. You know, it was sunny out. It was hard to see my screen and I just made a mistake. But I had to rely on my relationship with that vendor to get them to give me the 0.18 Bitcoins as a refund, you know? So that's what it kind of comes down to. You got to work it out if you do make a mistake like that. And yeah, the decimals give people trouble too. It's really a lot to get used to if you're talking about switching from the land of credit cards and the land of bank accounts to the land of Bitcoin, which puts a lot more responsibility, as Andreas so nicely noted, onto the buyer.
There's another word for that responsibility. Freedom!
We've been getting involved a little bit with the elections that have been going on at the Bitcoin Foundation, hosted a series of debates for the candidates who are running for the individual seat. And one of the things that really has jumped out at me for the last couple of weeks, but it became absolutely pronounced when we started talking to all of the candidates who are running for these seats, is the complete divide that we actually have in this community. When I talk to reporters, a lot of times they call people crypto anarchists. Crypto anarchist is the word that reporters like to use because it sounds kind of scary and they don't really understand what it is. But I think that I've identified some better characteristics. I think that on the one hand, you have entrepreneurs, and on the other hand, you have idealists. And really the difference between them, they both see Bitcoin as an opportunity, but there are differences in how they reached that decision point for them, where they recognize it as an opportunity and decided to go for it. That really fundamentally flavor how they look at this space as a whole. And I wanted to talk about this a little bit with you guys and get your thoughts on it too. On the one hand, you've got entrepreneurs, and the entrepreneurs are people who, broadly speaking, have been looking for opportunity, because we live in a world right now, at least in the United States, this might not be true elsewhere, but I think that it's true just broadly speaking in the global picture, where opportunity to actually create something is diminishing. And the areas where you can truly innovate and not be constrained by either requirements of enormous amounts of permission or enormous amounts of money, and sometimes those are interchangeable. So these are people who are looking for a way to build a business, and they look at Bitcoin and they see this thing that has all of this potential, and people are talking about it like it's the internet, you know, in 1992, which means that there's all this growth potential that's on top of it. And they can see that, and they can see the opportunities that are there because there are so many basic services and basic functions. Exchange has certainly been the most prominent of these, but there are others too that need to be provided. Mining is, of course, another obvious one here. There are lots of people getting into the mining space because they see that as an opportunity to build out the infrastructure. On the other hand of this spectrum, you've got people who are idealists who look at Bitcoin and they say, this is the thing that can save our world. This is the thing that can create a fairer and more, I don't think beneficial is the right word, but a more equitable society where people can be judged on their merits and where business and commerce can flourish in a global way as it never has before. So they're interested in it not necessarily for the business building elements as they are for the societal or cultural changing elements of it. And this is a fundamental disconnect, because what that means is that if you're an idealist, you don't necessarily care if it complies with the current legal and regulatory structure because you don't really agree with the current legal and regulatory structure. Whereas if you're an entrepreneur, not complying with the current regulatory structure is basically the same thing as saying, okay, well, I'm not going to have a successful business, because how can you have a successful business if you aren't compliant? If you can't pay your taxes in a legally compliant way, then you can't have a legally compliant business. So therefore,
so hang on, Adam, are you saying that there are no people who are in both camps?
Oh, no.
Are there no idealists? Is this more of they're predominantly idealists or predominantly entrepreneur focused?
I think that they're not compatible. I think that there is certainly a little bit of overlap, and there are people who are conflicted on this, but I think the people who are becoming prominent are in fact very polarized. And there are some people who are just not making a decision on this at all and just playing the middle ground, but I think that group is small and they're not really doing too much. That's the fundamental difference right there. And there are some other differences too. You know, one of the other ones is how these people look at altcoins. You know, I've talked to a number of entrepreneurs who feel that not only is Bitcoin for sure the only cryptocurrency that can succeed because it's already achieved the network effect, which means it's past that first major barrier to adoption. But beyond that, that if Bitcoin were to fail, then all altcoins de facto would fail because the thing that was leading the charge failed. And so therefore they follow what the leader does. Whereas if you talk to the idealists, they feel exactly the opposite. They feel that Bitcoin, whether or not it succeeds isn't actually important. What's important is that just like eGold before it or Hashcash before it, whatever you want to talk about, these are systems that came out and had an impact on the culture, influence future design, which is basically what altcoins are. They're future designs of other cryptocurrencies besides Bitcoin, and then they went away for whatever reason because they ran into a problem. And then whatever came out after them tried to fix that problem, whether successfully or not.
I think it's also a matter of time perspective, right?
I was going to say that too. Yeah.
Yeah. The idealists both look at the long game of being able to look at the long game because they're not that interested in the short-term profit, perhaps. I don't think the entrepreneurs really are that interested in the long game or have the luxury necessarily to look at the long game. They have to get into this market, make their mark, and exit the market successfully within the next couple of years. That's really the situation. Or, flip it and leverage up and go to the next thing. They're not looking for changing the world in 25 years. They're looking for make a buck in 2.
I would almost call them, instead of entrepreneurs, I would call them maybe opportunists or something versus idealists, because what I see a lot of the entrepreneurs doing is seeing an opportunity and saying, okay, well, what do I need to do to be able to best exploit this opportunity or take advantage of it? Right. And that's fine. That's just one way of being. But yeah, they tend to be people who have been in the Bitcoin world for a shorter period of time and maybe are way more focused on sort of saying, well, what do I need to comply with in order to be successful, rather than I would like to change the world in 25 years, like Andreas said.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily a value judgment, though, because in the Bitcoin market, even if the divide is as strong as Adam suggests it is, both of these communities are vitally important to the success of Bitcoin because you need that short-term opportunist to really put the focus and effort into turning this into a commercial success, which also brings others. But at the same time, you also need the idealists who's looking at the long game and thinking about the impact this will have on society. So, these two categories, if you like, as different as they are, as diametrically opposed, perhaps they are in their motivations and goals, both absolutely necessary to Bitcoin, right?
There are some things that they agree on. Everybody agrees that, and I think this is why the first conference that we went to, that conference in San Jose, was called the future of payments rather than the future of money. Because if you think about it, the future of payments is a very specific term that talks about payment technology, basically, and suggests that that's what Bitcoin is, when really, it could be argued that, yes, it's a payment network, but it also arguably is the future of money, much more than it is the future of payments.
The entrepreneurs picked that title for sure.
Exactly. But I mean, that's kind of the thing. And another thing that really has jumped out at me is the importance of internationalization.
The idealists would have called the conference the death of banking or something like that. The death of legacy crappy fiat currency. Conference 2013. Come, bring your family.
One thing that I was thinking about during this whole discussion is the sort of tension between the idealists and the opportunists or the entrepreneurs, for me, really was highlighted when I was at the New York conference, and Jaron from Coinsetter, he was giving a talk and was saying, well, we don't really need to be anonymous with Bitcoin. You can tie it to your social security number and bank account, and chargebacks, that wouldn't be so bad. Like, I think those features need to be built into Bitcoin to succeed. And then of course he's got that Regulate Us Club, right, where it's a group of businesses where you have to be pro-regulation to take part in it, and they're going to decide how Bitcoin, how they want to be regulated.
Which organization is that, Stephanie?
I don't know the name of it, but it is some basically club of businesses that want to be regulated, and a requirement for membership is that you have to be pro-regulation, and we're going to decide, how this is going to go down.
I read about them in the DSM-5, I believe.
What disorder is that called? Well, the tension between these two types of people really came to a head for me. It was really highlighted for me when Jaron was giving this talk, and Adam really held his feet to the fire after the talk by asking him different questions. Really? You think that Bitcoin anonymity should be taken away, and you think chargeback should be built in. Tell me more about that in a very skeptical way. And I loved it. I thought it was great. That discussion needs to happen, and people need to see it and decide where they fall in it. But to me, that moment and some of the other questions, which were great that Adam was asking at that conference.
Well, thank you,
I think most of the talks that happened where people were saying stuff like that, Adam was really there holding their feet to the fire, which I really appreciated. That just shows the state of the whole conversation. I think you're right about that it is very polarized.
But it's also a bit of a bell curve. I have to say, I think there is a certain percentage of the entrepreneur class that is so short-term and opportunistic that they really don't give a damn about any of the implications on society in general. Now, I would call that class of entrepreneurs the Paris Hiltons or the Kardashians of Bitcoin. In some cases, really, we don't really know what they do. They run businesses that don't really do anything. Some of them are just suing other people.
But we know we've made it big.
Right, exactly.
When we have our own Paris Hiltons.
Listen, there's a very similar cohort on the other side, which is the idealists who are so caught up in the ideology that actually don't implement design code or do anything because that would violate some principle. So doing nothing violates no principle whatsoever. Arguing is the only principle. I think, if you look at those two extremes, there's still a very good, nice, productive middle.
I totally agree with you. But, I think it follows on with the conversation we've been having about internationalization and what, and just in general, you can see all of these fights that are happening right now, like the fight over whether or not lobbying should be a priority for anybody, or if it's something that should be left to organizations like Data that are forming with the idea that they'll try to represent virtual currencies or represent digital currencies with various legislative bodies, as opposed to having specifically Bitcoin businesses spending time and money and resources on trying to make that case up front. If you're someone who really wants to have a legal business, then that certainty to you is incredibly important. But if you're not, then it just doesn't matter at all. It seems like it seems like you're, like the conversations we've had before, where you're essentially inviting in someone who's going to do you harm. The other side of it, of course, is the internationalization, right? Because the internationalization, for people who are on the entrepreneurial side of the equation, they don't really think it's that important, generally speaking. And I'm talking about entrepreneurs who are in the United States. They don't think it's important because they think that the U.S. sets regulation. And so because the U.S. sets regulation, whatever happens here will echo out to all of the other jurisdictions. Whereas, again, if you talk to the idealists on the other side of the issue, then that's completely the opposite. And we should not be focusing on it at all. We should just be building everywhere that we can. And regulation will eventually catch up if it's going to catch up. And if not, then hey, that's fine too.
It's going to be interesting to see how this shakes out with different countries deciding, or different, geographical locales deciding what they're going to do with Bitcoin, because then there's even more opportunities. Okay, we'll go to the place where it's most Bitcoin friendly and we'll try to start a business there. But then there's going to be a lot of competition. There can be different niches. I see those opportunists seeing the opportunities there, doing what they do best and taking advantage of them, right? So it's true. We need both. We kind of need both to make Bitcoin happen, and the productive middle. By the way, where do you guys think we fall in that? Do you think we're in the productive middle? I really hope so.
I think I'm more in the productive middle now than I've ever been before. Who do you think should be making decisions? I mean, if we want to talk about broadly speaking, I don't really feel like there's a future moving forward where we're going to have a healthy middle ground of both making decisions. I feel like that this has to go one way or the other.
I think the answer to that really goes back to the basics, and I'm going to do a bit of hagiography here and say Satoshi Nakamoto was an idealist, not an entrepreneur. From the very first sentence of the Satoshi Nakamoto paper, it is very clear that the purpose here is not to build a better business, not to build a better widget, not to build a better coin. The purpose is to change the world. And that comes through from the very first sentence. So at the end of the day, this whole endeavor started by idealists. I think we should thank the entrepreneurs and keep fighting for what's right.
Let me challenge you on that, Andreas. Idealists are good catalysts, right? I mean, so you talk about the two different personalities when it comes to their business style. Broadly speaking, again, these are huge generalizations. You find that on the idealist side, a lot of times you have catalysts who are much more interested in starting something like Satoshi did. Satoshi was a good catalyst who started Bitcoin and then got the heck out of the way. But there's nobody running this. There's nobody who has gotten out in front and taken over, the PR for Bitcoin. There have been a couple of pretenders, but it's never really worked.
I'd argue that they are running it, and they're running it in the only way that matters, because these ideologues write code. And at the end of the day, that's the difference between being an ideologue who can't do anything and being an ideologue who has an effect. So writing code is how ideologues act in this particular case, and they are absolutely doing that on a daily basis. And there are critical decisions being made every day in Bitcoin by the developers that are part of that ideology.
Hello, I'm Jeffrey Tucker, Bitcoin enthusiast and host of the upcoming Cryptocurrency Conference in Atlanta, Georgia, October 5th. We've got a marvelously libertarian-infused day of discussion about what is indisputably the future of money, and you are invited. For those of you who can't attend, we've partnered with Let's Talk Bitcoin to offer video conference passes available for government currency and, of course, Bitcoin. For more information, bitcoinvideopass.com.
More than 300,000 users and counting trust blockchain.info. It's a Bitcoin wallet service and a wealth of Bitcoin information, and is completely free to use. With a blockchain.info wallet, you'll get the convenience of a web wallet and the security of a desktop client. Blockchain.info is also a block explorer. You can use it to see Bitcoin transactions in real time, check the balance of any Bitcoin address, and view many handy Bitcoin charts, all for free. See what they have to offer today at blockchain.info.
Development in the Bitcoin space often happens in leaps and bounds, and the people who are responsible for innovations that come out in the future are not necessarily the same people who have been responsible for those innovations in the past. Today I'm joined by Daniel Larimer. Daniel and I have been trying to get together for the last couple of months now to talk about some of the projects and ideas that he's been working on, because really, despite the fact that you've probably never heard his name before, is at the forefront of a lot of what's going on in the space, and has a very exciting project that I'm really looking forward to getting into with you today. Daniel, before we get into that, can you tell me a little bit about how you came to cryptocurrencies and sort of what your experience has been?
Yes, some background about myself. I'm a software engineer who started studying economics and libertarian philosophy several years ago. And I discovered Bitcoin early on when it was still possible to mine with your CPU. I knew it was going to be amazing, and I bought $20 worth of Bitcoins. Then I got busy with life and wasn't paying attention. And next thing I knew, they were worth $30. And I had several $1,000s, and I thought this was really amazing. But I still didn't have time to really innovate. I didn't have any ideas at the time. But this spring, when Bitcoin went to the moon to $275, I decided to look into it again. And I noticed that one of the biggest problems we had was how to create a decentralized exchange. That got me thinking and started posting on the forum.
So decentralized exchanges are something of a holy grail within the Bitcoin community, because the primary pain point that most people can easily identify is, in fact, that moment of exchange from a government currency into a cryptocurrency, or the other way around. The difference between a decentralized exchange and a normal exchange, what is that, Daniel?
It has to do with trust and central points of failure. A decentralized exchange has no one who's holding your money for you. It allows you to have price discovery without a central server. It works best if you have people that can meet up in person. So there are no big organizations or banks or accounts that can be seized. And if you can achieve that, you can add a lot of value to the entire cryptocurrency realm. But more important than that is how users interact with one another. You need a way to identify people and to communicate, because that's what an exchange is. It brings people together to place bids and asks and discover prices. There's a really multi-sided problem here to solve a decentralized exchange, and we've come up with some really innovative solutions.
So a decentralized exchange, in much the same way that Bitcoin takes the idea of money and takes it out of the hands of a few and puts it into the, hands of many, and so many, in fact, that most people can use it as a system, but nobody can modify the system. This is pretty much the same here, is that the primary pain point when it comes to exchanges is that there's one central entity, and that central entity can be regulated and can be pressured, basically. It's a choke point to a certain extent. And so because of that, this otherwise decentralized currency is easier to control because it has these few points that everything must pass through on its journey from government currency into cryptocurrency.
Correct. Now, the decentralized exchange is just the start. It was the beginning of a journey that has yielded much more than I could have imagined at the onset. In the process of coming up with the ideas of BitShares, which you may have heard about in the Bitcoin Talk forums, we've recognized the need to distribute communication and identity and to make cryptocurrencies easier to use. I'm working to create a company, Invictus Innovations, and what we're doing is trying to amplify cryptocurrencies. We want them to be so easy to use that people never have to see a Bitcoin address again.
You said Applify, not amplify, right?
Yes, Applify. We want to do to Bitcoin what Apple did to computing.
Okay, I can definitely see the need for that. And that's certainly something that people have been talking about. Again, this is another holy grail, is usability for Bitcoin. So how does one go about Applifying the experience?
The first thing is to understand the user experience. I'm a longtime Mac user, so I have high expectations for usability of systems. You want it to be as easy to use as email. You have minimal configuration and no need to trust. So we looked at this, and I wanted to create a system that would allow effectively Namecoin, except we can support 1 billion users with unique names attached to their public keys. And with this, you can combine it with a system like BitMessage, and you have decentralized email that's zero configuration and allows you to connect with your friends and family.
So you're talking about combining Bitcoin with BitMessage as far as functionality is concerned. And then where does Namecoin come into this? Let's talk about Namecoin for a second. This is something listeners might not be overly familiar with. Namecoin is a distributed DNS system. You're going to be able to explain this better than I can. I know it has something to do with the .bit domains.
I will explain Namecoin here very, very briefly. Namecoin is a way of using a blockchain to allow people to buy domains. The challenge with Namecoin is that domains people are used to paying for. People aren't used to paying for email accounts. There's a ease of use issue with having to pay for something. If you have to pay for something, people don't do it. So I wanted to create a way of giving a name, a meaningful name, to a public key that didn't involve users having to get out their checkbook, didn't involve having to figure out how to get into the cryptocurrency space and all the things associated with an exchange. The user experience I wanted to create is you download our client, which we're calling Coyote, and you run it. You go through a setup wizard and you type in your name that you would like. It tells you whether or not it's already been reserved on the blockchain. If it hasn't, then you're free to reserve it. And you end up mining your name. And you can't transfer it, so there's no economic incentive for squatting. But for a little bit of CPU time, you can have your name registered globally and uniquely in a decentralized database.
You mentioned communications in BitMessage. So I use BitMessage, and BitMessage has addresses that look very, very similar to Bitcoin addresses. They just start with BM dash in front of them. So how exactly is that going to work here? In your system, what is a name going to look like? If I wanted to send you a message or something else, what would I be typing?
I would tell you that my name is Bytemaster, and you type in Bytemaster.
And because you've mined that name, it means that you own that name?
I own that name as long as I renew it once a year.
And renewing it, again, that's not a monetary process. That's you devote your computer to it. So like, how long would it take for me to mine a name?
That's still being evaluated, but I'm targeting about 1 hour of CPU time per year per user.
Okay. This is a passive process where, like I set my computer to do it, and then I come back in an hour and it's done?
Yeah, so when you first create your name, your computer will dedicate its full attention to reserving it for you. After you've created your name, you can set a threshold for like 1% of your CPU power that will be dedicated to renewing your name, which will on average keep your name renewed every single year. Now, this actually causes a unique phenomenon. Not only do you get your name registered, but you now have a record of when your account was first created and how much CPU power, because I track how many times you've renewed. As a result, you have resistance against Sybil attacks. Your identity has age and reputation based on effort put into creating it, which means you cannot just dispose of identities anymore.
So you said Sybil attack. I'm not familiar with that. Am I saying the word right?
Yes. This is an attack where in anonymous systems, someone can create as many accounts as they want. So if you are using a traditional news aggregation site like Digg, you could create 1,000 accounts and vote up any article you want. That's known as a Sybil attack because you don't know that these identities are unique. With the system that we've come up with, you can identify how unique a name is by the economic cost of creating the name. And that's tied basically to mining power. What level of difficulty have you achieved for your name?
So this is something that, again, when we talk about mining, generally speaking on the show, we're talking about how hard it's getting to mine. Is this something that over time will get harder to mine, or there will just be less available combinations?
The network is targeted to require a maximum amount of bandwidth of a streaming radio station. As a result, when we get to 1 billion users, it will maximize the bandwidth. And at that point in time, the difficulty will start to rise. Until then, it doesn't actually rise very much.
Okay. So one more question here, and then we can move on to my next question after this last question. So you mentioned that you mine these on a blockchain. Where is this blockchain? And I mean, is this, because we're not talking about the Bitcoin blockchain, are we?
No, this is a very unique blockchain. The reason why we couldn't use something like Namecoin is because it cannot scale to handle 1 billion users with the data size and remain as decentralized as we would like. So we had to get the size of the transaction as small as possible. And in this case, the size of the transaction used to register your name is less than 100 bytes, which is a third the size of some of the smallest Bitcoin transactions. Mm-hmm. Furthermore, because you don't have to have extra transactions involved in exchanging or trading, you've reduced a lot of the overhead on the network. So our target was decentralization. We want everyone to be able to use these names, not just for email or communication, but to log into websites to create accounts. So basically a decentralized identity for the entire internet. So to achieve that, it needs to be lightweight enough. And we cannot have a system that grows to hundreds of gigabytes like Bitcoin is going to. And we don't want to burden people with all the extra overhead of a currency if all they want to use is an identity system.
So this is a blockchain specifically devoted just to these usernames, essentially, and that's the only thing that it does?
Correct.
Okay. So I buy the premise. What happens when I have secured my name? What can I do with that?
Once you have secured your name, anyone, anywhere on the internet can reference that database and validate you are who you say you are. It means if you are posting an article on Bitcoin Talk and you'd like to be tipped, you can just put your name down. And as a result, people can just look up your name and they can send you Bitcoin. They can contact you privately, securely, with all the privacy of BitMessage. You can log into websites that support authentication using this database.
So when did Bitcoin come into this? Because I heard us talking about communication, and I heard us talking about identity, but I haven't. Where does Bitcoin come into this since it's on a separate blockchain?
Well, the Coyote client is, after we get the communication done, we're going to make it into a Bitcoin wallet. Bitcoin uses public keys, and the same public key system that we're using for the ID system that we're creating and for our messaging system. So your identity that you use for signing your messages can also be a Bitcoin address that you can receive money from.
Is that a Bitcoin wallet, or is it specifically just one address, and that address is like a public address that I would have associated? So like if my name is Adam B. Levine on stuff that I do, then I would put that down. And if somebody sent money to Adam B. Levine, then it would be routed to this specific Bitcoin address that I've set up as my primary public or something?
Yeah, it won't be routed there. It just is your address.
Oh, it is?
Yes. Your public key published to Atom can be converted into a Bitcoin address, and people can make donations to it. Using our client, you won't even have to do that process. You will just say, I would like to send Atom 1 Bitcoin, and it will send you a Bitcoin. Now, that's good for public donations, to donation addresses, but it would be a compromise to your privacy if all your transactions were done through a single address. But we have a solution for that as well. The way we accomplish that is you can friend people. Just like Skype, I can send you a message and says that requests that I be your friend. And the Coyote client will automatically negotiate a exchange of Bitcoin addresses that are unique for each contact you have without the user having to manually copy or manage their addresses.
So every time I want to make a payment to you, is it automatically negotiating this, or is it when we become friends or when we become connected that it generates one? And so like I would have one address that I would send from and receive to for Atom's relationship with Bytemaster, right?
It's actually much more robust than that. I'm using a hierarchical deterministic wallet, which allows me to give you the information necessary to generate as many unique Bitcoin addresses for me as you need to make payments. So each time you want to make a payment for me, you can just calculate a new address and use a new address each time without having to synchronize with me. And my wallet will be able to generate the private keys, and I'll be able to know that all of these payments are from you. So for one exchange of information, you can now send me payments whenever you like.
That's pretty neat. So we've got a name system, we've got a messaging system, and we've got the name system is also an identity system. You said it can be used on other websites besides ones that you're going to be operating. I could think about this like blockchain.info, except instead of it being a bunch of anonymous names, it could be essentially a directory where if someone wants to look up my name and reference me, then they can do that. They can see all the information associated. I mean, right? This is still kind of public, isn't it?
Yes, it's very public. Your name is actually stored as a hash, so you can't search it for a name, for any name, but you can test a name. Is it there? And you can say it is. So you can't just observe it. You have to check each name you're looking for. But what it really is a database that replaces certificate authorities. You're probably familiar with SSL connections that you use for your online banking and all the different websites you log into. That's all based on certificate authorities that certify that this public-private key is actually owned by the person who owns this domain name. The problem is there's no certificate authority for people. Well, I take that back. There is, but it's so hard to use, and it's full of backdoors. The government can sign for you. And the certificate authority, you have to trust them not to forge anything on your behalf. So it's a trust-based system. With our ID system, you have replaced certificate authorities with a new blockchain that allows websites to authenticate users, automatically create accounts, and prevent spam accounts from being created by setting thresholds for reputations required to create the account.
So this sounds fairly similar to the project that we've talked with Joe Cascio about, because he was kind of looking at doing something real similar with Bitcoin addresses that have some sort of reputation tied up with them, and then using that Bitcoin address as a identity on a variety of sites. So getting back to the sort of blockchain.info comparison, if I on Let's Talk Bitcoin wanted to one of these names on the blockchain with our website and wanted to have that as a login, then essentially the website Let's Talk Bitcoin, when I'm logging in, would send a request to this database and say, is this person here? Right?
Yes, it would be a challenge response system where you would say, prove you are this person, and you'd give me some random data. I would sign it with my private key, and you'd be able to verify that I am indeed the person who I say I am, and therefore log me into your website. And this would be a two-part system. You have the browser plugin that checks the client and does all the signing on the client side. And then the website itself would have a server-side process that would make sure that the login was authenticated and create your account for you.
Are you telling me that we can have an address that's LTB or Let's Talk Bitcoin or something like that, something that's short and I can actually say on the air, and then people can send me money straight to that without me having to have them come to my website? Because that's a pretty big deal. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay, that's really cool. Well, good job on that. So why hasn't somebody else done this yet? Because I've been waiting on this one, I got to tell you.
The challenge in the space right now is everyone is trying to think about how to create a better currency. With the exception of Namecoin, everyone is viewing Bitcoin as a currency. We have adopted a different philosophy that is going to revolutionize the way people design and build products in this space. Instead of a currency, we view Bitcoin, Namecoin, as a distributed autonomous corporation, where the currency is just the shares, the ownership of the corporation, and the corporation provides services to the community. Now, those services can be currency service, a record keeping. They could be a name registration system like Namecoin. There are many things you can do with a distributed autonomous corporation that we have a roadmap of a dozen different ideas of ways to use blockchains in new and innovative ways. The ID system is just the first example, and it's a rather unique blockchain that there's no currency to trading. The value of mining is having your name, and everyone is mining and confirming everyone else's name in the process of registering their own name. So it's providing a service to the community without having shares per se. Your shares are your reputation. But there are many other things you can do once you realize that a blockchain is shares of a distributed corporation. And then those shares should earn profits for the shareholders and pay dividends. And with that, we have designed systems like BitShares. You can do prediction markets. You can revolutionize so many different industries if you think about it with this mindset, because no longer are you just creating an altcoin that's trying to compete to be a currency. You're trying to provide a service, and the number of services, whether it's registering domain names or providing arbitration services and escrow services, is unlimited. And it's all about engineering the incentives to allow people to coordinate and cooperate via a blockchain. And the key ingredient to all of this and all blockchains is that you need a way of identifying people and communicating with people that's easy to use. And that's why we've opted to do the communication and the identification system as the first steps on our roadmap toward a Bitcoin wallet that's easy to use. And then we're going to go on and make cryptocurrencies easy to use with our BitShares protocol, which will allow the creation of BitUSD or BitGold. And these are cryptocurrencies that have all the properties of Bitcoin with the added benefit that they track the price of gold and silver in a decentralized way with no counterparty risk. And they also pay you dividends. So you can hold BitUSD and earn greater returns than you would in a bank account. And we believe that this is just the tip of the iceberg of the things that are possible when you start adopting a different mindset.
So how far out is the first version that I can actually use?
We are working as hard as we can, 12, 14 hours a day, to get the communication, the name system out. You'll be able to start seeing screenshots of it, C3, the cryptocurrency conference, with a beta out for your use by Thanksgiving. And after we get the communication out, we're aiming to have full Bitcoin wallet integration by the end of the year.
That sounds like a very ambitious schedule, but I got to say, I'm anxious to see more competition in the wallet space, especially where the focus is on usability rather than some of the other things we've seen featured. Not to say that I don't love the security of Armory Wallet, but usability would be awesome if I could just send coins the same way that one sends an email. So, Daniel, if somebody is interested in your project, wants to learn more about it, or wants to get involved, what's the process for doing that? And are you looking for anything in particular?
Yes, we've got funding, but we don't have people. We are looking to find top quality C++ developers, particularly if you know anything about Qt and GUI development. And if you're interested and have time and availability to work with us, you can contact us through our website at invictus-innovations.com. That will allow us to tell us about yourself and what you can do, and we'd love to have you on board. Our mission as a company is to provide decentralized solutions to centralized problems. We're really a philosophical company, and we want to engineer freedom, find free market solutions to to create a more free world. And working here is going to be a very fun experience.
Well, Daniel, I look forward to our next conversation on the topic, and we'll have to talk about digital autonomous corporations next time, because that definitely is a very interesting topic. Daniel, thank you very much for the work that you're doing, and really looking forward to seeing this product.
Yeah, thank you.
EasyDNS is the Swiss Army knife for your domain names, helping meet their customers' individual needs since 1998. EasyDNS has been an outspoken critic of SOPA and CISPA. EasyDNS was an early supporter of Bitcoin, and now they are proud to sponsor this show. Do business with a company that shares your values. Get a 13% discount when you pay with Bitcoin. Go to bitcoin.easydns.com and be sure to use discount code LTB. Hi, Stephanie here. Would you like to turn your book into an enthralling audiobook? Need a persuasive commercial to promote your company? How about a narrator for your explainer video? Here's where I can help. I'm a freelance voiceover artist, and since 2009, I've lent my voice to dozens of audio projects. To hear some examples of my work, check out my website, smvoice.info. If you like what you hear, I'd love to be the voice of your next project. Get in touch at smvoice.info.
So speaking of the Kardashians of Bitcoin and those who we can't quite tell what they're doing in this business, I really, really have no idea what Coinlab does. I'm sure this is not going to make me popular in certain circles, but I have no idea what they do. I know that they tried to build a partnership with Mt. Gox, but what we're finding out recently is that in the process, they ran off with 5 million. Well, interesting stuff.
The story we're talking about here is this ongoing dispute between Coinlab and Mt. Gox. They originally signed an agreement back in, I think it was November of last year, where Coinlab was going to become Mt. Gox's essentially agent in the United States. They were going to handle regulatory compliance, and in exchange for that, they were going to get an exclusive license to North America for all of Mt. Gox's customers. All of Mt. Gox's customers were supposed to become Coinlab customers, and there was a revenue split that went back and forth. When we first saw the terms of the contract, when this became public, I think it was in might have been May. I don't recall. Anyways, earlier this year, back in Q1 or Q2, we found out about this. And a lot of people identified this contract as being kind of predatory on the side of Coinlab because there were a lot of gotchas in there for Mt. Gox, where if something went wrong, then they lost a lot of money. It was going to cost them a lot of money. And so when Coinlab sued them for breach of contract, that's kind of what we thought it was. Now, a couple of months have passed and Mt. Gox has filed its response. And in that response, they essentially say that the contract is null and void because Coinlab didn't fulfill their end of the bargain. And their end of the bargain was compliance as specified by the law by a certain date. But there is a twist to this. Andreas, did you see the twist, the 6-day difference?
Yes, there was a slight difference in the end of the contract and the date for coming into compliance, which essentially in this case means getting state licenses. And the key here was that literally days before the end of the compliance deadline, FinCEN comes out and in their memorandum says that pretty much anybody who does this has to be a money transmitter. So literally days before the end of this obligation, suddenly this obligation becomes a 47 state licensing obligation.
So days before, when they were compliant going up to that point, so 7 days before this contract came due, they were actually in compliance with it. But then, one more day passes and this new guidance comes out and suddenly they're not only not in compliance, but they're screwed because there's no chance that they can ever be in compliance in the amount of time that they have left.
So one key lesson here is never sign a contract in Bitcoin that says that you will remain in compliance, because you cannot remain in compliance. There is a government here that is going to try to make sure that you are never in compliance. They'll keep moving the goalposts. So, that's a key lesson here. They were in compliance up to days before, right?
Is it possible to do this type of business, to have these I mean, this wasn't even a long-term agreement. This was a 6-month contract and they couldn't even hold that up. This is the thing, getting back to the topic we hit on previously about the entrepreneurs. This is exactly why they're so gung-ho for regulation, because regulation, whether it's good or whether it's bad, at least there will be rules then, and the rules won't be expected to change on a kind of ad hoc basis.
I don't know, but they could still change.
Oh, they'll change on a very ad hoc basis. Absolutely.
But I mean,
I don't think
what's the point?
Regulation. Yeah, what's the point?
No, I mean, seriously, like, what's the point of having regulations if they can change at any time? Because that means you can't make plans for the future because you might be wrong. And then not only are you wrong, but you've allocated resources incorrectly.
Right, which only matters if you're not part of the guild, and therefore those regulations will be used against you in a court of law. If you're part of the guild, then none of the regulations really apply because, oh my, we didn't know, we couldn't tell, it was just that guy, the big whale, the derivatives, it was AIG's fault. Who knows?
Well, I mean, that's a great question that you asked, Adam, because indeed, what's the point? I can't answer that question, which is why...
wait, consumer protection. No, sorry, never mind, not that one.
Right, which is why I don't understand the push for regulation, because they are going to change. There's not going to be the certainty that people are looking for. They're not going to get their need for certainty and clarity and predictability met by getting regulations. So why don't they just try to roll with whatever's going on right now?
I take a utilitarian approach, which is if these regulations actually protected consumers, I'd be very much in favor of having at least a modicum of rules that are clear and easy to understand. But really, that's more of a having rule of law and contracts in place so you can figure out what's going on. The problem is this has nothing to do with consumer protection, right? At the end of the day, none of these regulations really protect us. And we've seen this in practice again and again.
So then it becomes about getting inside the guild, like you just said, so that you're immune from having any of these enforced on you. And that's the subtext here. So many of these businesses, I think they do want to be part of the guild and they want to get on the good side of the regulators so that they won't have these used against them.
We had a really good interview with one of the representatives of money transmitting associations. If I remember correctly, his main argument was you can't comply because they're going to change the rules. As soon as you try to comply, they're going to shift the goalposts. I think the lesson there was that even the money transmitters, those who have the coveted licenses, are second-class citizens in the financial industry and are being hounded, their banks being shut down, their licensing being discriminated against. So it's all, the same problem. What they're facing is exactly what Bitcoin will face. And the lesson there, the warning, the cautious warning was, don't try to change the regulation. You'll never be compliant.
Okay, then let's talk about the consumer protection aspect of it for a second, because there is actually a change coming up. I believe towards the end of October, we have a change coming with the implementation of the consumer portion of the Dodd-Frank rules here in the States. Those Dodd-Frank rules, notably, are going to require that anyone who is a money transmitter, which again means any sort of Bitcoin exchange, has to provide a 30-minute price guarantee and refund period for anyone who's making a purchase with them or trying to send money with them. We've talked about this in the past briefly, but again, with something like that, where we're talking about consumer protections, it's a different question because that sort of breaks Bitcoin to a certain extent. But I'm asking more about the consumer protection side. Is there any consumer protection that you think would actually be applicable?
I think the most effective and powerful consumer protection laws are those that involve transparency. If the consumer is able to be well informed about the transaction, I think that helps. And certainly the laws that apply there help. Breaking Bitcoin to make it more consumer friendly, I would say no to that. If the regulation comes through and it says, people need to be able to do refunds or people need to be able to do chargebacks, then what that's going to do is it's going to force those who are in that part of the business to simulate that. And the way they're going to simulate that is by doing a lot of know your customer and anti-money laundering and taking your identity, doing a lot of credit checks, and then putting a lot of limits on your transactions in order to be able to essentially offer insurance, refund insurance.
Okay, so I'm going to pivot this question again. There's an ATM that has come out called RoboCoin, right? And there are going to be these in Canada. There'll be units in, I believe, the United States. I'm not exactly clear on where. And rather than try and position themselves as a vending machine, as we've seen Lamasu do, where they don't have to necessarily have all of the KYC requirements, they have gone full bore into it. In order to make a purchase with this, you use cash and put it in just like you do with the Lamasu machine. But in order to make a purchase, you need to put in your government issued ID. Then you need to have your face scanned, and then you need to have your palm print scanned. And then that information You haven't seen this before? You haven't seen this yet? Yeah, this information is associated with the purchase that you've made. So I've been sending emails to the various people correspond with on the legal side of things and saying, okay, so if Bitcoin is really, really, really difficult forensically to try and follow the money on, but you have these points of entry where you can definitively tie identity with all these, verifying factors to one person, then what's to stop a law enforcement agent from, say, 40 transactions after it's left your hands, somebody does something illegal with it? What's to stop them from tracing it back?
Adam.
Yeah, right, exactly.
His thumbprints on it.
It's not even about blaming the purchaser. It's about identifying the purchaser as the easiest point to start the investigation, which then means if you use one of these to purchase, then you could have a knock on your door or somebody, calling you up and saying, hey, where did you spend this? And then they go from you to the next person you spent it with until they eventually find the person. If we lived in a world where you had a right to privacy, unless you actually committed crime yourself, then it might not be a concern. But that doesn't really seem to be the world we live in right now. So what do you guys think of that sort of move with these ATMs?
Yeah, it's concerning. I wouldn't use one. But then again, it's getting more difficult to get Bitcoins anonymously. Even if you're going on local Bitcoins or you're buying them from your friend or whatever, somebody along that chain somewhere has their identity potentially tied to those Bitcoins, right? Mining's a way to get them somewhat anonymously, but it's getting harder and harder. And so, maybe we'll see a big price premium for Bitcoins that are bought in such a way that you don't have to tie your identity to it. And then the market's speaking, and then it's just an artificial distortion that's imposed by all these requirements that you identify yourself to get Bitcoins.
Or maybe we can learn from the past and look at how government has behaved when placed next to a large trove of data. Their little eye gleams, they take their little grubby fingers and they reach across and they take all the data and they stick it in their pockets because they're greedy little. So the bottom line is that we're going to have to build Bitcoin in such a way that all of the clients basically do anonymizing mixing when you buy a Mars bar. And they do it again when you buy some gum from the store, and when you buy a soda, and when you buy a car, and when you buy $1 billion worth of drugs. And at every step in between, every single transaction should be anonymized. And at the end of the day, that's going to deny the opportunity for people to do these kinds of things.
Won't that hugely add to the blockchain? I mean, like if for every transaction you have to do, 20 other transactions have to occur because you have to mix, then
actually, no, not at all. In fact, and this is, I think, a very interesting project that's come up. You can look at things like CoinJoin. I'm going to be doing an interview on that topic. And in that case, what you're doing is you're simply grouping transactions together in such a way that obfuscates the origins and destinations. But if you do that systematically across the whole network, it makes it damn hard to figure anything out.
So basically, as we have more identity associated with the points of entry, we need better obfuscation throughout the actual process. We need better mixing and we need more service. Okay, that's interesting. I'll buy that. So what do you think about the idea of using physical Bitcoins more? Because again, we've talked about this in the past. The only actual anonymous way to transact Bitcoins is to use physical Bitcoins, because with physical Bitcoins, you're not actually making a transaction on the network. You're actually giving someone a wallet known to contain a set amount of Bitcoin that can be redeemed one time by one person, but before it's redeemed can change hands and is completely anonymous, just like real cash is in person. And of course, it has the liabilities of cash too.
I think the threshold is so high that people will use real cash instead for a very long time before that happens. It's definitely the destination where we're going. In the meantime, we have to make the network into a darknet by default.
Okay, so this has been like the most long and rambly topic I think we've ever done, but I actually do want to ask a question about that. I have spent some time on the Onion, on the darknet that we have now. I've investigated I2P, and I have a basic understanding of how these things work. To my experience, they're pretty slow and they don't actually work that well. So does a system like that have a chance of scaling? I mean, we talked about this on an earlier episode, how, because the NSA has really breached the social agreement that they had with the cryptography community and the internet community, your contention, Andreas, is that we're going to have the internet become a darknet of darknets over the next 10 or 15 years. But is that usable?
Yeah, absolutely, it's usable. Once you do it at scale, the network effect ensures that you're not too many hops away from someone who has the right data in the right encrypted format that you can use. So yeah, it's slow when you have few entry and exit nodes, slow when the network doesn't propagate very fast. But at the end of the day, if you do have such a overhead issue. Let's say that the network is 20% slower if it's a dark net to start with, equivalence network. Well, with Moore's law, you'd have to wait about 2 years before, from a network basis, you've eaten up that overhead. And now you're sitting on a dark net that has the equivalent functionality but is dark. I think eventually that's where we're going.
This is where we say thank goodness for the idealists.
Thanks for listening to episode 44 of Let's Talk Bitcoin. Content for today's show is provided by Stephanie Murphy, Andreas Antonopoulos, and Daniel Larimer. Music was provided by Jared Rubens and Jazztown. If you can't get enough original thought and discussion, read our daily blog at letstalkbitcoin.com. Sign up for our weekly newsletter at theweeklybitcoin.com. To get in touch, send me mail at adam@letstalkbitcoin.com or visit letstalkbitcoin.com/talk to be directed to our listener subreddit.